as discussed at the beginning, we've had a very brief look at qualitative research. That's not necessarily in just within half an hour, 45 minutes of talking about it, to allow you to be a qualitative researcher. Basically, it's just to make you aware of that there's different approaches out there to doing research than the stuff we've covered so far with you in this course, which you might consider essential in becoming a critical thinker about the way we go about doing research in psychology, is basically knowing that the approach we teach you rests on specific assumptions as well, with which you could disagree, which you could question. You could think of reasons why a qualitative approach might be more relevant than the quantitative approach that we've taught you so far. That should be an active choice, and you should always question specific assumptions you make, even the assumptions underlying quantitative research. But it also applies on qualitative research, of course. So in the next section, we're going to have a critical look at qualitative research, but also apply the same criticism to quantitative research. And in so doing, give a final training or challenge to your critical thinking skills in the context of doing research in psychology. All right, so starting off with a challenge to that qualitative approach. So this is the God helmet. He has left us, unfortunately. He's started to work in Leiden, but Michiel van Elk was a colleague in the social psychology department. We did some work on the God helmet, which is something they created themselves, which is basically a somewhat antiquated helmet you would wear if you drive on your, what's the word? Your moped, I guess. I'm looking for an old-fashioned term for a scooter, but it's, yeah, basically a helmet, and they've applied some electrodes to it. And they gave people that helmet to wear and told them it's a God helmet because of the stuff happening in the helmet, the electrodes and such. It facilitates spiritual experiences. And as it turns out, that if people wear the God helmet, they're more likely to report having had spiritual experiences whilst wearing the helmet, and the intensity of having that spiritual experience increases as well whilst wearing the helmet. And there's a bunch of research and conclusions related to wearing the helmet. But the point is that if you tell people that their experience will change in such and such a way, it's kind of does, right? So telling them they're wearing a helmet that allows them to communicate to God does indeed changes their perspective on what they're thinking. This research was, among others, done on Lowland. You remember festivals, right? Back in the day when there wasn't Corona, people went to festivals, and that's one of the locations where you could do this type of research. And basically, this should make you question the value of that first-person perspective. So we have a lot of research in psychology in which shows that people can be wrong about their experiences. So we could put an emphasis on describing how people feel and how they experience the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is an adequate description that they'll give, right? People are highly suggestible, as this research and other research would show. So to some extent, you might level the following criticism at qualitative research, or research that's very much focused on getting that first-person perspective. Basically, the answer would be we can't get that first-person perspective on the world of the individual or of the researcher or the combination of the two. Because we're not seeing how people experience the world. No, we're only seeing what some people say about what they think, right? And that emphasizes the fact that people can mislead themselves or can be misled in how they experience the world and how they report about that experience. So basically, you are not authoritative about what is happening in you, but only about what seems to be happening in you, and we are giving you total dictatorial authority over that account of how it seems to you, about what it's like to be you. This is a quote by Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher, but you might apply that to our approach to psychology as well, right? We are basically interested in what it's like to be you, not necessarily. We don't presuppose that we can understand what it's like to be you, or we can see your first-person perspective by doing a research because of all the different biases and the suggestibilities and stuff. The God helmet we talked about. So you might question the use of anecdotal evidence, right? To what extent is a person's description of their experience even useful in understanding that experience? And if it's not, what would then be the point of doing qualitative research? I'm not, just as a disclaimer, I mean, that should be clear by now by the end of this course, but I'm not telling you how it is. I'm just trying to get your critical thinking skills going. And of course, you can come up with your own conclusion and your own perspective on this. I'm just giving you the raw fuel, right? You need to process it and see where you stand on this. But this might be one criticism of qualitative research, that to some degree it is lacking in quality, in the sense that the quality of experience, right? So the experiential sensations, or as philosophers call it, the qualia, or the different phenomena, the first person experience, we can't access that. That is walled off from our research efforts. That's even walled off from the person themselves, right? So it cannot be accurately described perhaps by the individual themselves either. So all the things, the things we're stuck with is the things we've been stuck with so far, right? We're trying to get a sense of different constructs by doing measurements, which might be related to those experiences, but we don't have a direct way of ascertaining that. The only way in which we can somehow validate our questionnaires is by looking at whether the observed measures, the questions we ask in a questionnaire, correlate in the ways that we expect the underlying constructs to be related as well. So we're basically trying to derive some idea of the construct level from the measurement level, and then seeing whether they correlate in a way that's in line with our theories. And that's the only way in which we have, the best way we have of mirroring that that qualitative experience. There's no direct way of going from that level to this level, would be the point. So perhaps in that way, qualitative research can be misleading. All right. We've looked at quality in qualitative research, right? I've emphasized the value of that first person perspective, at least in the IPA approach. And now we've questioned, or I tried to question the value of that, or the degree to which we actually can attain that first person perspective, or material from that information, useful information from that first person perspective. The second point that we can use to be critical about the qualitative approach is the lack of generalizability. So I've already pointed this out in response to one of the questions. Basically, to the extent that you are able to better understand the individual you're talking to, or you're analyzing the transcript from that individual, to what degree does that allow you to say something about the next random person that you encounter in a similar or different situation? Does it yield any generalizable information? And if it doesn't, how useful is the research? So using a quote by Brian Hughes from 2016, there are very few ways to evaluate usefulness in research other than in terms of whether the knowledge generated is found to be applicable outside of the study from which it arose. So one way of assessing research or being critical of research is being able to take the knowledge from the research and apply it in a new situation and see if it still holds. That's the way we have of evaluating the usefulness of theories in research. And if that's impossible, so if it's always the case that this situation is too specific, this individual is too specific, or the way of research that this qualitative researcher did is not necessarily the thing that you should do in a novel context, then how useful are the results from that piece of research if we can't use it outside of the context of that research itself? And how are we able to assess the quality of that research if it doesn't generalize in any way to different individuals, contexts, or research situations? Again, this should be the raw fuel for your critical thinking. You can disagree with this, but that's one of the criticisms that you could level at a qualitative approach. Subjectivity is an issue as well. So we can acknowledge our subjectivity as researchers, as we've indicated, right? So you should acknowledge as a researcher that your first person perspective on the world, your speaking position, has an influence on the research itself. But should we make it a core tenet of our research, or is that problematic, right? So I could acknowledge all my subjectivity all I want, but it's difficult to see why we should make that a central feature of the whole research approach, because basically my influence as a researcher on a research that's being done is potentially biased as well. There's a whole host of cognitive biases that we talked about in the first year, but also in the beginning of this course, right? The different heuristics that we use and the different biases that can result from those heuristics. And this confirmation bias we talked about this month even. And to say that I should put myself as a researcher more central and my subjective role as a researcher more central in the research. Am I not basically saying that I should be open to more bias in my research as well? Should I not just approach research or use all the research tools at my that are available to me to make sure that I cancel out that bias, that I cancel out that subjective role, that all the individual biases that influence my perspective as a researcher are minimized by the way in which we aggregate information and quantify it in such a way that other people can have a look at it as well. Again, raw fuel, make up your own mind, but we should be critical of the qualitative approach. The qualitative approach as well, but we'll get to that in a minute. Bear with me. All right, so we've talked about generalizability, subjectivity, and that first-person perspective, and which is all valued in the qualitative approach, which to some extent is something that we should realize, do we need it more emphasis on that as well in the quantitative approach. And again, I'm being critical on the same specific points. Relativity is another thing that we should be critical of, because we should wonder to what degree a relativistic point of view implies that it's impossible to be wrong, right? For me personally, but again, this is the raw fuel, make up your own mind. For me personally, it's difficult to see how somebody else can show you to be wrong if you're taking a relativistic stance on research or psychological constructs or psychological phenomena you're trying to research. Right, so if you can always debate what something is it depression really such and such, and does it really exist, or is it merely just a label for then basically you can analyze and reanalyze everything all I want, and it might be impossible for other people to criticize that point of view because it's so relativistic. To push that criticism to its extreme, one recent hoax might underline that potential criticism of the approach is that not necessarily related to qualitative research, but there were a couple of researchers who tried to get basically bullshit published in journals that take a more social constructivist approach to research, take a more relativistic point of view to research. And they basically written down what they considered to be nonsense, and they got at least 6 of those nonsense papers published, or got those research published in 6 different journals, such as the paper depicted here, The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct, a Sokol style hoax on gender studies, so in which they described about basically the penis is not a useful construct in talking about gender, but we should talk about the penis as a social performative construct. I don't even remember precisely what they written, but they consider it to be bullshit, and you can click the link if you want to get a more precise description. But they've written down a bunch of, they consider it to be nonsense, but they got it published anyway. So that kind of underlines this concern, right? So to what degree is everyone then just taking a relativistic point of view, just writing about whatever they think to be true without any way of checking whether they're wrong? And that would be a huge concern, right? If a certain approach or point of view makes it impossible to be wrong in science, that is worrying to me. So that has me concerned about the relativistic point of view, at least in more social constructivist approaches to doing research. And that might be a reason to emphasize quantitative research, right? I mean, in the way of the quote, there it is. The term quantitative refers to something that has a magnitude or an extent, which in effect means that it refers to a construct that is externally verifiable. It is possible to observe its status and, if necessary, for this observation to be independently corroborated. So this quote goes a long way to emphasizing why a quantitative approach might be useful, at least to my mind, is the fact that it allows me to, put my assumptions out there and make them testable for others as well. and we should be aware of relativism resulting in research publications or points of view in which people are impossible to be wrong. So, there's no free lunch, basically, would be the summary, right? Qualitative research does allow us to tap into perhaps that first-person perspective, or at least a description of that first-person perspective. And it does allow us to explore interest in different types of research questions that we might have been more interested in when starting out in psychology. But there's no free lunch. There's a bunch of downsides that might arise when we become too relativistic, too focused on this first-person perspective, or to focus or put our own subjectivity as researchers to central, and lack of generalizability might be an issue as well. Does it then mean that we need to avoid qualitative research? I'm trying to mess with your heads here, right? I'm basically saying everything we did before was wrong. No, everything I just said might be criticized as well. And I'm going to do that one final time, and I'm going to apply the same criticisms to the quantitative approach that we taught you so far. So, quality in quantitative research. We just drawn the conclusion that those qualitative experiences might be considered basically inaccessible to a research tools. But that does apply to quantitative science as well. So if you are very critical about the way we go about doing science, even in the usual way that we've taught you so far, so the quantitative way, you could say that the following: the psychological constructs consist of countable parts, right? So there's a lot of stuff that can be measured or at least counted, as we discussed with Denny. But our interpretations of those constructs appeal to the experience of the participant, right? If we're saying that somebody is more aggressive than somebody else, or participants in the experimental condition are more aggressive than somebody else, then we give an experiential interpretation or qualitative interpretation to those numbers. We're not just saying the number in experimental condition is higher than in the control condition. No, we're saying that that number reflects aggression. And the degree to which we can actually strongly make the claim that aggression is what is being measured with those types of measurements is questionable, as we've seen this block, right? As we've discussed with Denny, the degree to which the stuff we're doing in psychology can be called measurement is debatable. And as you discussed with me last week, the extent to which it's clear how the stuff we call measurement is related to the underlying construct is not very clear, and in a lot of cases not very well validated as well. So the step we're taking there might be considered qualitative to some degree as well. And the same criticism that we just leveled at qualitative research, we should bear in mind as well when thinking about our quantitative research as well. We talk about research finding in subjective terms, perhaps even without specifying the connection between the objective measurements or the counting and the stuff we're interested in. So again, there's that overview. We actually want to draw conclusions about the experience, quality, or phenomena, the what it's likeness, right? But it's walled off from our measurements. There's no direct way of getting from the measurement level to the experiential level. We just have the correlation between the observed variables and the implied correlations between the different constructs that we're interested in. And that's something to bear in mind as well. It's basically a restatement of the criticism that we talked about last week when we talked about critical thinking about constructs. So, we've been critical about the generalizability of qualitative research. Again, that same criticism we should level at quantitative research as well, or default research in psychology as well. One of the criticisms that might look familiar to you, depending on the courses you've taken, is that we basically do most of our research in psychology on weird individuals, which is an acronym which stands for white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. So, to some extent, you might say that generalizability of the research findings in psychology and the stuff that we've tested our theories on is very limited as well, right? Because to what extent will we get the same findings if we do the similar research on different types of people, right? Not white psychology students that we tend to use in our research, but people from different parts of the world. Basically, what I'm saying is that the criticism of generalizability that we've just leveled at qualitative research is something that we should bear in mind, always bear in mind when looking at our quantitative research as well. Is our sample representative? Was it truly a random sample? And am I drawing conclusions that apply only to people from this population? And I think you're going to notice in a lot of research, people are not that careful in generalizing. People draw conclusions about general psychological processes, and rarely they point out that, well, perhaps this only applies to white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people, and not to psychological processes in general. You see what we're doing here, right? We've been critical about qualitative research on the basis of 4 criteria, and now applying the same criteria to, qualitative research, or the way we've taught you about doing research so far. I've pointed this out before, right? So you could be critical about the role of subjectivity and putting the researcher, the subjective role of researcher central in qualitative research. You could also apply that. You should also be critical about perhaps the lack of acknowledgement of the subjectivity of the researcher in psychological research, right? So to what degree are we actually pretending that we don't have any influence on research results, or are we pretending that we are purely being objective as researchers when we actually can't, right? So one of the research results that is shown you at the beginning of the course was about the fact that if you give different research groups, different labs, the same data, the results from their statistical analyses might differ as well. That shows you that subjective role of the researcher, right? So that shows you the importance of different choices that researchers make. And that also shows you that it's not always entirely clear how the different choices of the individual researchers yields different data, even in statistical quantitative analyses. So that shows you perhaps that researchers in a quantitative approach should show more reflexivity as well, more acknowledgement of their speaking position or their subjective point of view in performing the research. This I already pointed out, but we could also be critical about the role of theory in psychology, which we have been, right? 2 weeks ago, we talked about the shortcuts that researchers take in deriving predictions from their theories, and shortcuts that they use in getting back from rejecting null hypotheses to concluding basically everything they want. So perhaps in an ideal way, that hypothetical deductive model of doing science, having a theory, deriving hypotheses, testing them, and moving on to new research, is an ideal, but perhaps in practice our theories aren't that well developed in psychology, perhaps because it's a young science and we're just getting started. But that at the very least should make us more open-minded about doing more exploratory research, regardless of whether that exploratory research is quantitative or qualitative. So where does that leave us? I hope this leaves you open-minded and critical. I hope that you realize that there are different approaches to doing research, and there's might be stuff that you're missing out on if you focus purely on that quantitative approach that we've taught you so far. And that perhaps it's useful, as a lot of researchers do these days, to combine the approaches in a mixed methods approach, for example. So combining the qualitative and quantitative approaches, usually using the qualitative approach in the initial phase of research, and in a more exploratory way, and then testing more general theories that you derive from that using a quantitative approach after that. So basically, you should be open-minded, you should be critical, and you should be pragmatic in the different tools that you use for answering the questions that are of interest to you. And you should realize that there's something we can take on board specifically from qualitative approaches to psychology, which is the importance of context, of the researcher, of the participants, the importance of acknowledging your role as a researcher in the research, the importance of reflexivity, the importance of an exploratory approach in contrast to just the hypothesis deriving and testing approach that we talked about so far. And perhaps the importance of an answer-driven approach over a method-driven approach. So what type of questions do you want to answer, and be more focused on that instead of the specific steps you need to take when doing the research.